our last video, we talked about some basic categories of art fundamentals that we want to study. Today we're going to begin unpacking those fundamentals, starting with drawing. There's a couple of distinct approaches to drawing that I like to group. I like to personally call these flat and form approaches, or shape and form approaches. And basically, these are two different ways of thinking about how we are working with our two-dimensional page. So one is to think more in terms of the flat shapes and silhouettes as they exist on a 2D surface. And the other is to try to communicate 3D forms and an illusion on that 2D surface. Both of these approaches are important, and they can give us different insights into the way that we're creating our picture. Right now we're going to focus first on a form approach, and later we'll kind of come back and take a look at shapes. One of the things to note about form is that our lines when we're drawing are really important in describing what we're looking at. Here I've shown two cylinders, and you can see I've drawn a straight line here across one of them. This really flattens out the shape and doesn't communicate that there's a volume there. On the other hand, if I come in with a curved line around the middle, you can see how that instantly still creates that illusion of form that the rest of the cylinder was already giving us. So watching the direction that we're placing our lines and whether they're curved or straight can have a huge impact on what we're trying to use our lines to describe and how well that's being communicated. And you can see here, if I were to imagine that this was a actual physical object, I could kind of trace that line, that circle shape with my finger. And that's something I try to imagine a lot when I'm drawing things like this. I'll ask myself, does it feel bumpy? Does it feel like the lines are going up and down? Or if I were to run my finger around that elliptical shape at the top, does it feel as if it could actually be a circle that's turned in perspective? Because that's what an ellipse is. It's a circle in reality that's turned in perspective, so it's got this kind of flattened shape. Again, yes over on the right and no over here on the left, and that's kind of what we want to keep in mind if we don't want to flatten the image. The same thing goes for spheres. If I draw a flat line across this, you see how that immediately flattens the shape. It lacks any illusion of depth, but simply by tracing a kind of rounded line over the form, it immediately creates a sense that there's a volume to that, that's a 3D illusion on a two-dimensional surface. Another thing to think about with cylinders is the fact that they have kind of an internal structure. We're going to go over several types of forms today, and cylinders are a really important one to understand, so we're going to start with that and then move on to boxes. So the internal structure of a cylinder is that no matter how it's turned, there will be this kind of axis through the middle, and then there will be two lines that are perpendicular to that run through the widest part of the elliptical shape that we see on that cylinder. This is true no matter how the cylinder is turned. It's really easy to want to change that angle and adjust it, but if you think of the central part of a cylinder as kind of being like a letter, capital letter I, or something, where all the angles within that structure inside on the red lines, you can see those are all right angles, nothing's turned or tweaked. That holds true no matter how you turn the cylinder, and that's a really important thing to understand when we go to draw cylinders. You can see every one of those would be marked as a right angle. The other thing that's important to keep in mind in the structure of a cylinder is that as we turn that circle of the top into perspective and we see that elliptical shape of the top and bottom, if you're struggling with getting the shape of that right, this can be a really excellent way to adjust that. You draw a cross line vertically and horizontally through that cylinder, through the ellipse, and then you check to see if each of those quarters in those divided areas match, and if they're roughly the same, they're pretty close, then you know that you've reasonably well constructed that elliptical shape. If the center line goes too far to the side, one way or the other, or too far up and down, you have a ton more space on the top half than the bottom half, for example, on that ellipse, then you may find that you run into some problems. And that's a clue that you want to adjust that to have those quarters all be equal. And then when you're done kind of figuring that out, you can erase those guidelines and just leave the elliptical shape. So here's an example of some cylinders that are turned in every which direction. I've left a more light line so that you can see the part of the cylinder that would be hidden by the side as it's turned, and darken the lines that you would actually see. But hopefully that kind of gives you a very clear idea of which direction each of these are turned. Now what I want you to see with this is just what we were talking about before, that no matter what direction it's turned, that central structure is always the same. You basically have that letter I. So that can be turned any way, but what you don't have is the line running across the ellipse is never turned at any angle other than perpendicular to the axis, which is that central line of the cylinder. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about that's really important as we begin to understand forms and communicating forms on the page is the horizon line. This is also sometimes referred to as the eye line, and both are frequently used interchangeably. Typically, in just about any scenario where your feet are planted on the ground, as relates to viewing the earth, the eye line and the horizon are going to be about at the same point. That does potentially change if you're talking, setting out in space, in which case you would just think about the eye line. But anything that you're doing in a real world setting, you're going to want to think about the eye line and the horizon being pretty similar. This means that if you go up on a hill, the horizon will still be roughly at your eye level, or if you go down as far as you can get, maybe all the way down on a beach, the horizon will still be at your eye level. And this is something that we can use in perspective to help us communicate how forms are traveling away from our eye, which parts of a form are closer, which are further away from us, and how, again, we can use that to build our illusion on our two-dimensional surface. Another thing to note with these two examples here where I've drawn the character in to show you the horizon line, that would be a little bit different. I would say you'd want to imagine that character represents you standing there. Ultimately, you can have the horizon anywhere in the picture and the characters anywhere. The horizon is tied to the camera angle or the viewer of the picture, not necessarily the character's perspective in the picture. And I think that's an important distinction to note. But just something to tuck away for later. If that doesn't make sense for now, don't worry about it. But that is kind of an important thing to note. So in this scenario, you would imagine that you are the little character that's standing there. But technically, you could put the horizon anywhere in the picture as long as it worked for your composition and for the camera angle that you're trying to create. Something else that our horizon line tells us is that things that are flat, if I had something that is parallel to the ground level, looks like a flat sheet of paper, we're going to imagine this is a sheet of paper that we're seeing. The top side is blue and the bottom side is orange. And as it gets closer to the horizon line, you notice it gets flatter until we see, basically on the horizon it would just simply be a line. And then as it goes above the horizon, we see more and more of it as it goes further up. We see more and more of it as it goes further below the horizon. And then it compresses as it gets towards the horizon. That is typical of the way a flat plane like that, a shape, works in connection with your point of view with the horizon line. So that's important to note. Again, if this is new to you, don't worry if this doesn't totally all make sense yet, but it is something important to kind of take in. And then as we progress, hopefully this will make more and more sense. So you can see that actually right here, even though this isn't currently shown with a horizon line behind it, our cylinders all did this exact same thing. And you can see this right now where the top and bottom ellipse are actually parallel to the ground. That top ellipse is narrower compared to the bottom ellipse, just a little bit. But this is telling us a couple of things. One, the fact that we're seeing the top surface and not the bottom tells us that it is below our eye level right now, unless something was majorly tweaked, but we're assuming this is sitting on a flat surface. So it's not an awkward angle, it's not anything that we would need to account for that way. So what we're seeing is below our eye level, and the top plane that's parallel to the ground is narrower than that bottom plane if we could see it if this was a see-through cylinder. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in conjunction with what we just looked at as well on this page. You can see that same principle being applied here to a single object. All right, now we're going to get into perspective. We're going to talk about 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective for today. And we're going to talk through the steps of how to construct a 1 or 2-point perspective exercise using a horizon that we can see on the page. This is an important concept to understand in art. A lot of times when you actually go to create a painting, you won't have the luxury of being able to tie everything neatly up the way we do in this exercise. But the exercise can create a better understanding of a very important principle here. So that's why we do it this way when you're first learning these concepts and for practice. So one of the things I personally found the most confusing about perspective when I was beginning to learn was, where do I use these different concepts? And ultimately, the biggest rule of perspective that I kind of go back to, because there are some rules, but there's one that overarches everything. And for me, it is this: the rules are there to support the illusion. So there may be occasions where you break certain rules because breaking them supports the illusion you're creating better. But that's the thing that we want to think about with perspective. It's there to help us create an illusion on our page. So typically, when you see a cube that is turned like this one is towards you, that front face is directly facing you. There's no skewing. Everything is straight on. And that is typically going to be the type of scenario where you will see things done in 1-point perspective. And then if the box turns so that you see two sides facing you, that is typically going to be a scenario where you are using 2-point perspective. Again, there's the occasional exception to this, but for now we're going to stick with kind of, this is the concept, that a box turned like this will typically be in 1-point perspective, and a box turned like this will typically be in 2-point perspective. All right, so let's walk through a 1-point perspective exercise, and you can pause the video at any point if you need to slow this down, pause, rewind, and follow along with these basic steps. I will also note it's not cheating if you use a ruler for this. It's great to practice drawing straight lines freehand, just for your own confidence with drawing. But this is one of those places where the technical understanding is more important right now than your ability to freehand a straight line. So it absolutely is not cheating. If you want to use a ruler to make sure your lines are correcting in the right places, do that for now, and then eventually try it without and see kind of how you can improve going from there. But definitely in the beginning, don't feel like you're not allowed to use a ruler or something. That's just another useful tool in your toolbox. All right, so the first thing we want to do is create a representation of our eye line. And you can put this anywhere on the page. I suggest putting it a little bit higher for now, as we are going to do a perspective exercise where the box sits below your eye level. So go ahead and put it high enough that you've got room underneath to create your box below it. And because this is a 1-point exercise, we are going to go ahead and put 1 point on that horizon line. Now, the concept with vanishing points, which is what this is that lines that are parallel in reality, if they're moving away from the viewer, they will appear to converge towards a single point. So you'll see this as we build up this box, but there are lines that are facing us that aren't traveling in any direction away from us, but there are lines that are moving diagonally, and those are ones that are going to be traveling away from us. And any of those diagonal lines, we need to watch that if they would theoretically be parallel to each other, they'd converge at the same point. In this case, we have a 1-point perspective exercise, which means there's only one group of lines that are going towards a point. So we don't have to worry about any other sets of lines right now. This is just one set of parallel lines going to a single vanishing point. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is create a square or rectangle for the front face of our box. And from there, we need to begin by mapping in our first diagonal lines. So these lines will go from the outer corners, upper corners of the box, to our first vanishing point. The next step is to create another set of diagonal lines running from the lower corners of our box face, and again converging at our vanishing point. And what we're constructing here are the side corners there of the box. And basically, if this box was sitting in front of us, it would feel like that front face was closer to us than anything else on the box. And that's the reality that we're trying to mimic and create an illusion for on this two-dimensional surface. Okay, so the next step, I do want to go over one thing before we go into the next step. This particular step with these long diagonal lines coming from the bottom corners tends to run into a lot of problems as people are building this up. So I want to go over a couple of the pitfalls that you might want to avoid. Don't curve your lines like this. That's going to set you up for a really hard time with finishing your box later, and it'll be really frustrating. So you want to make sure your lines are straight like we looked at in the beginning. You also, there's a couple of other steps as we kind of get into this. I'll show one or two other pitfalls here. But basically just make sure that we're not doing that curved line and that we're getting a nice straight connection from corner to the vanishing point. Because it's the edge of the box, it's not curved. Okay, so the next step that we need to do is to find the back top edge of our box, as you can see there. That line is going to be parallel to the other horizontal lines on the front face of our box. So we're going to go however long we want that box to be and set that up so that we can see where the back edge of our box are. With that established, we can also find the back vertical corners and edges of our box. Another really important step to kind of look at some pitfalls, so I'm going to go over that briefly too, because this is one that stumps a lot of people, I find. A lot of times people will draw the lines diagonally back here. They won't go straight up and down, and that creates this type of effect. Or they'll go diagonally this way, which again doesn't keep that back plane facing the way that it would. It kind of tweaks with the shapes in a way that isn't going to support the illusion. Or they will get confused and draw a line from that top corner all the way down to the bottom front edge of the box. And none of these are going to allow you to finish your box in a way that is going to actually create an illusion, a solid illusion of depth. So you want to watch out for those pitfalls in that area too. Okay, so this is what you want it to look like at this stage. Once we've reached this point, we have only one more edge to find, and it's the lower back edge. So we're going to add one more horizontal line like that. And now we have all of our planes blocked in, so we can see which planes are kind of facing us, which planes are further away, and which planes are kind of traveling away at an angle. Now I'm going to emphasize this and go ahead and darken my lines for what is the actual box there. And then I'm going to go ahead and erase the lines and the vanishing point that are just construction lines. So now you can see if we erase the guidelines and the perspective lines, this is kind of what we're left with, and this is the form of a box all by itself. Now, if you wanted to have a box that was not see-through, this would be the way that would look from the front. And if you wanted to have a box that was open on the top, this is what it would look like from the front. So those are the two lines, two sets of lines that you would erase in the event that you wanted to kind of build this up like this, and then to go back and erase anything that wasn't necessary for what you were trying to show. So you'd erase from here and go to here, if you wanted to show a solid box, and you'd start from here and erase to here if you wanted to show a box that had an open top. And just for clear emphasis on that, I shaded in the inside of that a little bit so you can kind of see more easily the front face versus the interior that we're seeing of the box there. Another thing to note is that perspective works in exactly the same way above the horizon. It's just a reverse kind of project. If you spin around the drawing that you just did so that the box is above the horizon line, you're going to see it looks as if it's traveling above, and you're going to see the top and bottom planes of the box kind of working just the way we said the flat sheet of orange and blue paper would work. The closer it gets to the horizon line, the more compressed that surface is, and the further above it gets, the more of that surface we would theoretically see if this was a clear box. So just to keep that in mind, once you know the steps to do it below your eye level, you can basically do the whole thing above your eye level. It just starts with moving the point towards the bottom instead towards the top, if that makes sense. Okay, so that concludes a 1-point perspective exercise. The next thing we're going to look at is a 2-point perspective exercise, and we're going to build this in a similar way. So you're again going to start with your horizon line, and you're going to create 2 points. I suggest creating them as far apart on your page as you can for this particular exercise. You can experiment with placing them closer or further apart as you go along for understanding better, but for just beginning, this is kind of a good place to start. And I would also suggest don't put your box so far below the horizon line either that it's like all the way at the bottom of your page. Put it a little closer for now. That's going to give you a more realistic type of illusion versus pushing the vanishing points close together or putting the box way below your horizon or all three together is going to create more of a distortion, more of a pushed look. It's not a bad thing to play with, just to understand how it works. It's definitely something that could be used if you wanted to do an illustration that had a particularly pushed kind of look. But this is kind of the concept that for now I'd say keep your box a little closer to the horizon, keep your vanishing points nice and far apart. And again, as we're doing this, the luxury is that we have the vanishing points on the page. Ultimately, you want to understand this theory because in a finished piece, the vanishing points for the objects that you're creating don't necessarily always fall neatly on the page, so you have to understand how this works. All right. Now, just like we created the face the first time, which was the closest thing to us, this time the closest thing to us is going to be the corner that's facing us. So we're going to start with that edge of the box. You can put this in a variety of locations. Further to the left or right is fine. I'm just going to put it a little bit more to the center and a little bit off to one side. So that's just how I'm setting it up, so it's easy for you to see what you're doing here. But if you want to play with showing one side a little more steeply turned, then you can set it off further to the side, and that's going to give you a steeper angle on the side that's closest to the vanishing point. But again, for now we're going to set it like this. Okay, so your first set of construction lines that you want to put in are from the top of that corner that we just set to your first vanishing point over on one side. And then you're going to duplicate that for the other side, going to the other vanishing point. And this is creating the front two planes and the direction of those planes on this box. And we want to create a vertical line on either side to establish where the edge of that box actually is. Now again, this could be a long or short box. It's up to you where you put that, but something you can kind of play with and experiment with. The next set of lines that we want to do cross over in kind of a different way. So you can see that we started with lines that went straight from the middle and out. Now what we want to do is start from the outer edges of our box. So this time we want to cross over those. So if we start from the left edge there, we want our diagonal line to go towards the right vanishing point. And if we start from the right side, we want that diagonal line to go towards the left vanishing point. This is going to help us to start establishing the top plane of our box. and to find the edges that kind of go back, that travel parallel with some of the edges we've already established. And we're going to make this a see-through box. So we're going to do the same thing from the bottom of our exterior lines of the box. You're going to go from the left side over to the right vanishing point, and from the right side over to the left vanishing point. The last line that we need to find now is the back edge of the box. So going from the top to bottom of those kind of 2 points that you can see right there, we're going to create this straight edge. I'm going to repeat that step one more time so you can see it. And that is going to create the last edge of our box. And now we've fully constructed a box in 2-point perspective. I'm going to darken those lines so you can see what would be the actual box there. And again, I'm taking out the construction lines now so you can see the box by itself. If I were to erase those lines, I would be left with a solid box. Or, starting again from this point, if I were to erase these lines, this is what I would have for a box that was open on top. And the same thing goes, I didn't show this here, but the same thing goes with this 2-point perspective exercise. If you turn your paper around, you can see what it would look like in a 2-point perspective exercise that was above your eye level. I don't recommend drawing below your eye level and then just flipping your page to do the actual exercise. That is only a good way to kind of just see how that would look. But I do recommend actually taking the steps to draw the object starting from above your eye level and construct it that way. The reason is you won't always have the luxury in a finished piece of just being able to start something upside down and then spin it the way you want it. It has to fit with the other things in the setting that you're creating. And so it's important to be able to work with both and to create something both above and below your eye level without having to turn your page. But if you just need to see how it works, turning that exercise that you just did below your eye level is a good place to kind of start seeing what that would look like. And that concludes our 2-point perspective exercise. All right, we're going to end here for this video. Our next video will jump more into flat shapes and how we can kind of start to use that in conjunction with another property that we'll begin looking at, which is value. So we'll talk about that soon.